We're going to be looking at a gospel account, and it's when Jesus called his first disciples, and it's a passage that highlights the importance that Jesus places on us considering our desires as we seek to pursue and follow him. Our passage is from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 35 through 39, and I've titled this talk, "What Do You Want?" Our account begins with John the Baptizer hanging out with Andrew and another disciple that is not named. So John in verse 36 is with these two disciples as Jesus walks by and he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God." This seems to be a sort of shorthand for John as he announces Jesus' role and purpose in ministry. Earlier in verse 29, he says of Jesus, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." When John uses this type of vivid imagery of the Lamb of God, he's connecting both Jesus and his ministry to the most significant event in Israel's history, that of their redemption from slavery in Egypt, so that they could be brought into the freedom of becoming God's people. And so for us, we see through Jesus and discipleship to him this new exodus. A type of deliverance and liberation is taking place, and it involves people being rescued or delivered or saved from their sin completely. In verse 37, we continue. The two disciples respond to John's comment and follow Jesus. And I almost imagine them trying to keep their distance, and maybe they're trying to see what it is that the Lamb of God would do, and what is he like, or what activities would he be engaged in. I almost picture this from a scene in the movies. You know, you have some people who are trying to follow another individual, and they're not very good at it. And so they're pretending to try on sandals at the kiosk at the local market and listening into Jesus's interaction with others, but they don't want to get too close. They don't want him to notice them. Well, obviously, they're not very good at this type of work. And in verse 38, Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, "What do you want?" In essence, what Jesus is asking them is, what are you looking for? What are you seeking? And this question is going to be the main focus of this brief talk. And from it, there are going to be four things that I want to call our attention to as we consider Jesus' question. The first thing, this question invites us to notice our desires. When Jesus asked that question, he's asking these disciples into the inner world of their own desires. And let's say up front, this inner world of desire is often very messy and a very complicated world. We're not talking about our instincts here, but we're talking about our longings and our yearnings. And these words could almost be used interchangeably with that of desire. Here Jesus is inviting the disciples. I believe that he's inviting us to consider what we want most deeply. And so that really is the question before us. Can we pay attention to our desires? Can we notice them? It's easy to move through life without ever really paying attention to the desires of our heart. We're too tired or too busy, or maybe they're just too sentimental for us. I've got a life to live, I got a job to do, I got tasks to complete. But what happens if we don't pay attention to them? We tend to live a very flat life. And a flat life in terms of what we're seeking, but also a flat life in terms of our relationship with God. There's a sense that when we aren't in touch with our desires, a certain energy and focus and direction of our life is missing. Psalm 37:4 says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will do this. Well, the second thing, this question invites us to sift through our desires. It's a journey to discover what is deepest within us. What do we really want? What is it that we most long for? And as you do this, you begin to realize that some of our desires and longings are quite superficial or even trivial. These desires can even be in conflict with one another. Or they can even see that if we make these desires ultimate in our lives, that they become distorted and quite dangerous and destructive, both to us and to those around us. So, for example, a reasonable desire for money can morph into greed. But as we sift through our desires, what we'll discover is that some of our deeper desires are hidden or buried underneath our more superficial desires, in those lesser desires. And here, I believe that Jesus is inviting us to drill down, to sift through these desires and these longings of our heart. What Jesus is really asking us is to discover what we really want as we begin to follow him. The third thing this question invites of us is to share our desires with him. So we're not only to notice our desires and to sift through them, but when Christ asks us that question, it's an invitation into having a conversation with him about our desires. He's asking us personally, what do you want? What is it that you most deeply long for? And as I reflect on this really is a touching question that Jesus asks, because it reveals a God who is really interested in what we desire. And often, and sometimes I know, we have this image or this understanding or this picture of a God who is not really all that interested in what we want. We think God comes to us and says, I love you deeply, but I'm not all that interested in what you want. And your whole purpose for being here on earth is to do what I want you to do. And do we begin to see the conflict here with this picture of God that we have and what Jesus is trying to reveal to us, what God is really like? The other thing is that we might feel some resistance and ask, what's the use of our sharing our desires with God? He already knows them. And what we need to see is this isn't about giving him more information that God doesn't already have. It's about our relationship moving to a deeper level of intimacy and friendship. When we share our desires with God, we are, in a very real sense, giving God access to those areas of our life. We're opening up the door of our heart, and we're inviting him to enter our world of desire more deeply. Well, the last thing we see is that Jesus invites these disciples, and he's inviting us to participate in our own desires. The disciples respond to Jesus' question, what do you want? By asking him, where are you staying? And picking up in verse 39, he said to them, come and you will see. So they came and saw where he was staying, and they spent the day with him. It was about the 10th hour, or about 4 p.m. When I share my desires with Jesus, it's an invitation for me to participate in those desires, to allow those longings to motivate me into action. This isn't an excuse to sit back and to do nothing. It's not about passivity, but it's an invitation for us to participate in our longings, to allow them to motivate us into a type of relationship and interaction with God, where we begin to see him being at work and involved in our pursuit of these desires. Now, do I always get what I want? Not at all. And sometimes my wanter needs to be changed a bit, and my desires need to be transformed. But what we'll see is that Jesus came so that we might be able to align our deepest desires with the will of the Father, so that God can entrust us with his type of power, so that it's safe for us to be able to pursue those things that we want to do. So what is it that you most want? And how has God uniquely crafted you to reflect his image in this world? As we pause and reflect on these things, I want us just to take a moment and imagine what your life would be like if you were living in harmony with the deepest desires of your heart. Now, contrast this picture of yourself with that of what it's like when you're just doing what you're supposed to do, or what others expect you to do, or what the social environment demands at that moment. Can you sense the difference, the contrast between living from the inside out rather from the outside in? Jesus is in fact the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. You know, the question that we need to begin to ask is, how does that connect to being his disciples or apprentices? How does that shape our lives and reform our identities and our priorities and our existence, and allow us to begin to pursue those deep longings of our heart, those things that God has placed in us? You know, I would encourage you just to see these 4 things as a toolkit in helping you discern your desires. It begins by noticing your desires. Ask yourself, what do I want? And as you begin to identify your desires, then begin to sift through those desires. Begin that process of beginning to ask yourself, what are my surface desires and what are the deep longings of my heart? And then allow this to move you into an unhurried conversation with the Lord about your desires. And now, with Jesus as your companion and teacher and guide on this journey, allow those deeper desires to motivate you to pursue them with Jesus' help. Well, I thank you for this time. I pray these words are a blessing to you. May God bless you. Thank you.